Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2.
right, I guess we'll begin when everyone's ready. How's everyone doing today? I get to talk during lunch. That's a good time. That's a good time for me. You'll have something to do if other than just stare at me the entire time, which is good. So I'm going to talk about cannabis and pain today, a little bit about myself. My name is Peter Hendrix. I'm an associate professor over at UAB in the School of Public Health. My background is in clinical psychology. Are there any clinical psychologists in the room, by the way? I'm the only one. Or psychiatrists, perhaps, or social workers, counselors. Hello. Okay, so we do some similar work. Most of my work has been not clinical, but research-focused, clinical science and behavioral pharmacology. And I'm especially interested in addiction and the treatment of addiction. And cannabis has become an interest of mine recently, given sweeping legal changes. I think we have at least 8 states now where it's legal for recreational purposes, more for medical purposes. And I think it's only a matter of time before all states fall, including Alabama. So I think that the presentation today is relevant and timely, and I would guess within the next 10 years we'll probably have medical marijuana, or cannabis, I should say, in Alabama. Okay. I have no connections with the cannabis industry. I think it's always important to mention before I talk on this topic, I realize that especially as it pertains to drugs of potential misuse or abuse, that emotions run high often, that they've been politicized for a very long time now. And it's my objective to provide you with objective information, scientific data, that's as free of politics as possible. I do hope I don't offend anybody in this. I do realize that, again, the use of these substances has been politicized, and obviously there are people who suffer from addictions whose lives have been impacted. And though most people who use cannabis appear to do so without any problem, I don't have any doubt there are some who've really suffered as a result, and I don't take that lightly. So a little overview, we'll talk about acute versus chronic pain. We'll talk about the epidemiology of chronic pain and the existing treatments, and then I'll talk a bit about cannabis, its background, the evidence that exists with regard to its efficacy for pain. Compare that with opioids, and I'll say a bit about NSAIDs as well, and then discuss some safety considerations should we find ourselves in a short period of time in a state that has legal medical marijuana or cannabis. I have to keep telling myself to say that, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Okay, so the basics of pain. Sorry, I'll have to stay in one place. It's hard for me to do that. So that's a signal in your nervous system that something's wrong. And we've all experienced it, so I think we all know that. It's described as unpleasant. It could be a prick, a tingle, a sting, a burn, or an ache. Pain is an interesting phenomenon. Obviously, it's more than just a nervous system response. There's also an emotional or psychological response. And there are some really interesting studies that would find, for example, some people with no evidence of any sort of damage to their lower back or knees would report a great deal of pain. It's hard to understand why. Others who might have evidence of damage to their back or their neck or their knees would be very active and report no pain whatsoever. And we're often puzzled in these situations and don't quite understand why it is that some people report a lot of pain where there doesn't seem to be a medical explanation, and other people report no pain when there is. And the best thing I can tell you is that it's a complex process that involves psychological variables. And we can talk about that a bit more if you have any questions, but that is relevant as it pertains to cannabis and the treatment of pain, because the treatment could very well address some physiological processes, but they also could be addressing psychological processes. And I think either are legitimate. So there are 2 types of pain. Acute pain, this is pain that comes quickly. It can be severe, but it lasts a relatively short period of time. This type of pain should go away as your body heals. And then we have chronic pain, which is defined as any pain lasting more than 12 weeks. And that can come from an injury or can have no clear cause whatsoever. I don't know if you can read the comic strip. It's Johnstown Acupuncture Associates, and below it says, "You gotta be kidding. Your back still hurts. So chronic pain is a pretty major public health issue. About 11% of Americans suffer from chronic pain, with 17% of those reporting severe pain. So this is severe chronic pain that they live with daily. And some of the more common causes of chronic pain would be osteoarthritis, non-specific low back pain, neck pain, fibromyalgia, and IBS. So those would be the most common causes of pain. So what kind of treatments do we have? I'm sure you're all familiar with this chronic pain scale, the chronic pain scale. Well, we have physical therapy, we have acupuncture that is empirically supported. Physical activity, exercise like yoga or Tai Chi can be effective, electrical stimulation and surgery. None are especially effective, they certainly work better than nothing. And then we have pharmacologic treatments, which include non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, opioids, and cannabis, which we'll be talking about today. Now, there is evidence, I'll give you a little teaser, that cannabis can be effective for the treatment of pain, and the Institute of Medicine has even said as much. However, they've also said that they're hesitant to recommend cannabis as a treatment for pain when there are FDA-approved medications to do so. And those would include NSAIDs and opioids. We have a problem, however, because NSAIDs have been tied to gastrointestinal bleeding. Some of you are probably aware of this, as well as in terms of chronic use, potentially neurodegenerative disorders. So NSAIDs do not come without their risks. And obviously opioids are problematic, and you've probably heard that we have something, I wouldn't quite say epidemic, but we certainly have a problem as it pertains to opioids, and many people are dying every year. So this may be where cannabis can fill a void, and again, the preview is it appears to be pretty darn safe and effective. That does not mean, though, it's without its risks, and we'll talk about those. So what is cannabis? I prefer the term cannabis, and I'll tell you why. Cannabis sativa is a plant that's been around for thousands of years. And it's followed humanity where humanity goes, or I guess we could say humanity has brought the plant with it wherever it travels. And the term marijuana was generally unknown of in the US until around 1900 or so, when it became associated with one of our first waves of Mexican immigrants. And there was quite honestly, a sort of political attempt to demonize the drug. And part of that attempt involved the Spanish or preferred Mexican slang term for the drug, which was marijuana, because some wanted American citizens to associate the drug with this immigrant population. So given that sort of history and connection with a propaganda effort, I prefer to stick with the scientific term, although it's also widely known as marijuana. As you've already heard, I will slip and use the term myself many times. So the flowers of the plant contain concentrated cannabinoids, and there are over 60 cannabinoids in the plant. We often focus on THC. That's responsible for this, primarily responsible for the psychoactive effects of cannabis. But keep in mind there are many other cannabinoids as well, and we don't completely understand what they do. Some of you perhaps have heard of cannabidiol or CBD. I'm curious, how many people have heard of CBD? Some of you? Some of you, and at UAB, CBD is being tested as a treatment for seizure disorders, or seizure disorder among children. CBD is not psychoactive, which is interesting, and you could drink a gallon of CBD oil and it wouldn't feel any different than drinking a gallon of olive oil, which would suggest, I guess, you'd feel sick, but there'd be no psychoactive effects. So there are many, many cannabinoids in that plant. We've mostly focused on THC, but it's kind of a complex organism there, and we'll get into this a bit later, but this is where it can get a little tricky to create a medicine from the plant if we're taking a plant that has 60 cannabinoids and only extracting one. So The flowers are really what contain most of the cannabinoids. The leaves contain lesser qualities. And hashish or resin is made by extracting, you see these little hairs that are growing, like little white hairs that look like they're covered with dew. The resin or hashish is made by extracting these, the THC from these trichomes, these little white hairs. So in brief, here's what we know about cannabis and pain. So as I mentioned, the Institute of Medicine has indicated that there is evidence that cannabis is effective for the treatment of pain. From a recent meta-analysis, I'll just quote directly, I think it's pretty clear. 6 trials that included 325 patients examined chronic pain. 6 trials that included 396 patients investigated neuropathic pain, and 12 trials that included 1,600 patients focused on multiple sclerosis. Several of these trials had positive results, suggesting that marijuana or cannabinoids may be efficacious for these indications. And so there's some good evidence that cannabis may be effective for the treatment of pain. Another study found, to be more precise for those of you who might be pharmacists, a single inhalation of 25 milligrams of 9.4% THC herbal cannabis. So concentration of 9.4% herbal cannabis is actually on the low end if you've been to Colorado or Washington. And if you're curious like me and you've taken a tour of these dispensaries, you'll see that most of the flower that they now sell is closer to 20 or 30%, which, as far as I can tell, is extremely potent. So 9% would be on the lower end with regard to what people might get at dispensaries in states where it's legal. So anyway, this 9.4% THC, cannabis used 3 times daily for 5 days reduced the intensity of pain, improved sleep, and was well tolerated. However, we clearly need to understand better further long-term safety, and efficacy studies are indicated. So there is some evidence, I think strong evidence at the moment, that cannabis can be an effective treatment for pain. We do have opioids though. So the question is, why not just use opioids? Okay, so among individuals who have been treated with prescription opioids, the prevalence of problematic use, so there's evidence of abuse or dependence, misuse. According to 3 separate estimates, was at either 52.6%, 17.1%, or 28.7%. Among those treated with cannabis, the prevalence of problematic use was, by these same measures, 21 and 10% respectively. Right, so 52% for opioids versus 21% for cannabis, and the other estimate 17% for opioids versus 10% for cannabis. Right, so there's always already some evidence, and this is just one of many studies that would indicate cannabis is less addicting. Some other interesting findings that have come out, and I believe this article was published in JAMA recently in 2014, medical cannabis laws are associated with lower state-level opioid overdose mortality rates. And so these aren't perfect studies, and there are alternative explanations. Science is a cumulative process, but when you look at those states that have medical cannabis laws where individuals have access to cannabis, and you compare them with neighboring states that don't have such laws, you'll find that those states that do have lower rates of opioid overdose mortality. It's a good sign. So one potential explanation of this is individuals who might otherwise seek opioid medications for pain, seek cannabis, and in doing so, you see lower rates of opioid overdose deaths. We also see that cannabis use is associated with a lower odds of prescription opioid use in individuals with HIV and chronic pain. So again, it's consistent with this narrative that if given the option of using medical cannabis, those who might otherwise use opioids will do so. And there are some really interesting findings, and this just came out maybe a day or two before I was preparing this presentation. And in this study, they had healthy cannabis smokers who were given oxycodone and then tested for pain tolerance and abuse potential. And in brief, they found in this study that cannabis seems to enhance the analgesic effects of subthreshold oxycodone, which suggests a synergy without actually increasing cannabis's abuse liability. So one interesting line of work might be, using opioids in combination with cannabis, knowing that we could use lower levels of opioids and get a therapeutic effect. So what about risks? Okay, so I have a chart here. This is not one I developed myself. This is from two separate peer-reviewed manuscripts by Gable. And what this chart is, on the vertical axis, the dependence potential of a drug, and on the horizontal axis, its active to lethal dose ratio. Right, so if you look down in the bottom left corner, you see LSD, that's lysergic acid diethylamide, and psilocybin, which is the active component in a genus of mushrooms. Both of those would be would have very low dependence potential, and it would be nearly impossible to fatally overdose on either of those two drugs. In the top right corner, you see heroin, and heroin would be a drug that is has a very high dependence potential and is, you might say, very easy to overdose on, a very dangerous drug. Right? So the drugs up in the top right are dangerous, those in the bottom left are less so. Can anybody spot marijuana, by the way? Okay, so we see marijuana is considered to have moderate to low dependence potential. So that doesn't mean that some people don't become addicted, they do. But it's generally not especially addicting. And an overdose is essentially theoretical. It would be very difficult for that sort of thing to happen. Now, you've probably seen some of the humorous news reports where a journalist will go out to Colorado and someone will task them with trying a cannabis product legally and film this. Has anyone seen any of these? And I mean, there's some humor to it. Certainly not fun for the journalists, but they will often decide to consume an edible THC product because they don't want to smoke, understandable, and they end up consuming far more than they should. Often because when they first eat the product, they don't feel anything for a while and think that they should take more, not knowing that sometimes THC takes a long time to be absorbed into the bloodstream, and they end up with way more than they should, and common reactions would be anxiety, maybe paranoia. They check themselves into the emergency room because they think they might be dying. They aren't, but they would be treated probably with a benzodiazepine and watched until they are ready to go home. So certainly that would be, an overdose, but a fatal overdose would be nearly impossible. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So the safety ratio is the ratio of the average fatal dose to the average recreational dose, and bigger doses would suggest greater safety. There is no known fatal dose of cannabis, and it's been estimated that such a dose must be at least 1,000 times the amount typically consumed. So to put that in perspective, if one of these journalists, let's say, had a single cookie during their visit to a Denver dispensary, a fatal overdose would include 1,000 cookies. I don't know anybody who's capable of eating that much. Right, I'm not trying to minimize this, but I just want to make it very clear. I think it would be nearly impossible to have a fatal overdose on cannabis. Some other interesting research that's come out recently that even surprised me and continues to surprise me, and this is just one of a few different studies, but there's really no evidence that cannabis causes impairment in driving. And the sort of impairment that we do see with driving is similar to that observed under the influence of a legal alcohol limit. So that, again, is surprising to me. There have been other studies that have found no association between cannabis use and motor vehicle accidents. And some explanations have been perhaps cannabis drivers are extremely cautious, drive very slowly, maybe drive well under the speed limit. And there's, yes. It is funny. In Colorado, my understanding is that law enforcement has been told that you can spot someone who's driving while high if they're driving well below the speed limit. If after the light turns from red to green, they take a long time before proceeding to the intersection. So it could be that those, my guess is that many people who choose not to get behind the wheel of a car, but those who do are perhaps extremely cautious. And that might be related to the sort of anxiety and paranoia that I mentioned previously. But in any event, there doesn't appear to be any impairment, which does not at all suggest that anybody should use the product and then drive. But if we're having a full discussion of risks, there does not appear to be a risk associated with motor vehicle accident. Okay. So there are 350,000 drug treatment admissions every year. They're mostly adolescents and young adults, and over half are referred by the criminal justice system. Okay, so to put things in perspective here, we have at the top, these are all treatment referrals. And in green are people who are referred by some source other than the criminal justice system, and in, what is that, purple? Those who were referred by the criminal justice system. And you'll see that for almost every drug, people are generally referring themselves to treatment more frequently than the criminal justice system is. But when you get to marijuana, you see that it's more likely that one who uses marijuana will be referred to treatment by the criminal justice system rather than themselves, which is probably an indication of how the drug is viewed in general. That is problematic perhaps by politicians, by the criminal justice system, but not as much by those who use. Now, one thing I'll mention, and only briefly, and this touches on policy just a bit, but one reason why I actually think that cannabis, we should at least strongly consider decriminalization, which does not mean, as some people have said, that cannabis would be available on every street corner, but that we would reconsider criminal penalties for possession and use, is that even though the population of cannabis users reflect the population of the United States, over 80% of those who are arrested or convicted or imprisoned for cannabis use or possession are African American or Latino, which says something about how law enforcement is doing their job. And I think for that reason alone, we need to decriminalize the drug before we can figure out how this law is being enforced. Now, I talked about dependence, right? It is not a drug with a great deal of dependence potential, but some people do become dependent. About 9% of those who use cannabis end up becoming dependent. So that's not insignificant. Like about 1 out of every 10 people will become dependent on the plant, the substance. Now, if you compare those rates to alcohol and cocaine, they're 15% and 16% respectively. So fewer people become dependent on cannabis than these other drugs. But it's also important to note that cannabis dependence on average does not create the same sort of social and personal problems as alcohol, cocaine, or heroin or other drugs of abuse. So in other words, those who are dependent on cannabis, you don't see their lives spiraling out of control. They generally don't have problems functioning at work or having successful relationships with others. And that's why the Institute of Medicine would classify the degree of dependence as weak. So it would be somewhat similar to cigarette use. Certainly there are people who are dependent on cigarettes. 20% of the US population smokes cigarettes. 500,000 Americans die every year from tobacco dependence. That is a major epidemic. But as I'm sure some of you know, if you've known someone who smokes, people who smoke can carry on very successfully. They have jobs, they have families. In general, tobacco is not ruining their lives acutely, but it's slowly killing them. And the same sort of thing you might say about cannabis, and at least to the extent that people who are dependent seem to be able to carry on with their lives fairly successfully, although it's not clear that the health effects with cannabis are nearly as severe as they are with tobacco. So even though I said there is no known fatal overdose for cannabis, the CDC's Wonder database reported 26 deaths between 1999 and 2007 attributed to cannabis dependence. I don't know how to explain that. And nor do really any scientists. I would gather that what this indicates is that a coroner somewhere indicated that the cause of death was cannabis use. So those are 3 deaths per year. Compare that to number of deaths associated with tobacco, 500,000 per year. The number of deaths, and just in the US alone, associated with alcohol, about 100,000 deaths per year. So it doesn't even come close to those 2 drugs that are legal and tolerated. Now the Drug Abuse Warning Network, this is, for those of you who aren't familiar, a network that records what they call mentions of drugs in emergency departments. Indicates 375,000 so-called mentions And that's more mentions than any other legal drug except for cocaine, which is about 425,000 a year. But all that means is that somebody has come to the emergency department and it has been noted that that person had been using cannabis. And very often, those individuals had also been using other drugs. So it doesn't mean that the cannabis was the reason for their visit, but that that individual presented to the emergency department perhaps was intoxicated on alcohol, perhaps had also been using cocaine, and also had THC in their system. It does increase the likelihood of cough, phlegm, and wheeze, but believe it or not, there's no consistent association with pulmonary function. And in fact, a study published in JAMA that was conducted by a group of researchers at UAB and at UCSF found, believe it or not, that moderate users of cannabis had better lung functioning than non-users, but that the heavy users of cannabis had the worst lung functioning, right? So that there might be a parallel with the alcohol literature where moderate drinkers have lower risks of cardiac outcomes than non-drinkers. So again, I'm not suggesting that anybody take it up, and obviously it's illegal in Alabama. But you know, a curious thing is we don't see any association with lung cancer or kind of chronic lung disease, and there's some evidence that it might even be protective. And one benefit of legalization would be the increased use of vaporizers, which is something you see in states where it's legal. Not only vaporizing the plant material, but there are distillates that are somewhat like e-cigarettes, which must be less harmful than actually combusting the plant. I don't know, I'm assuming. I think e-cigarettes are considerably safer than actual cigarettes, so I think there's probably a parallel there. So, you know, one question is, why don't we see associations with lung disease? And why might there even be a protective effect? Well, keep in mind that cannabis users typically inhale more deeply than tobacco smokers, but they consume far, far, far less cannabis than tobacco smokers. So here's an example. 20 grams of tobacco per day is typical for a cigarette user, 20 grams. Whereas if a cannabis user smoked 4 grams per day, that would be an extremely heavy habit. Extremely heavy. So, you know, there's the amount of smoke that you expose your lungs to when you're a cannabis user is just not at all equivalent to that of a tobacco smoker, and that might be why we don't really see this sort of associations with lung function until you look at individuals who smoke a lot. There are mixed and weak results linking marijuana use or cannabis use to respiratory cancer, and one thought is that there are some of those cannabinoids, some of those 60 cannabinoids that might actually inhibit the growth of tumors. Now, there is evidence that points to a probable but weak causal link between cannabis use and psychotic disorders. The thought being that if you have a genetic predisposition to psychosis, such as schizophrenia, that cannabis will probably hasten the onset of the symptoms. So certainly, if an individual had a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or other psychotic disorders, cannabis use would be contraindicated. And there is a correlation between cannabis use and poor academic and occupational performance. And this is normally the point in the slideshow where I'd have like a photograph of Shaggy from Scooby-Doo or like Cheech and Chong or something like that, right? So we know that there's this sort of notion of this amotivated stoner who doesn't really do anything. The question is that a cause of the drug use, or are there certain personality types that are sort of drawn to using the drug chronically? And the evidence would suggest that it's the latter, right? So it's not that we could take someone who's productive and engaged and motivated and give them cannabis and suddenly they have no interest in doing anything but watching TV and eating. But those who are generally not that motivated would be those who'd be more likely to be getting high all day. Right? We could say the same thing about excessive video game play or TV, right? So is TV a bad thing inherently? Would TV make you an amotivated person? Probably not, but we probably know people who sit around watching TV all day, and that's certainly not a good thing. So, you know, clinical application, which is the future, it's very tricky, I think. So we have a plant that people smoke. If the FDA were to approve cannabis, then we're asking them to approve a plant that is smoked. And the FDA prefers to approve a very specific and isolated drug that would be administered at specific doses. So for those of you, again, who are pharmacists, physicians, you can imagine the complication in simply prescribing cannabis to a patient. How much are they using and how frequently? I don't know how this can be done. There are medications, Marinol and Sativex, that essentially contain THC, but as I mentioned, the plant contains more than just that one cannabinoid. The plant contains 60 of them, and we don't really know how they all work in synergy. However, there's some growing evidence that CBD is beneficial, and in fact, many of the sort of risks associated with cannabis use can be offset with higher proportions of CBD. So that's just what we know about one of the other 50 plus cannabinoids. What is the best way that we go about standardizing a plant? I don't know. I think that's a big challenge. I don't have an answer to that. And I think that's why in states that have medical cannabis laws, we don't see that the FDA is involved and that there are pharmacies or physicians who can recommend a specific amount to be used at specific intervals. It's just, here's your card, go to the dispensary and pick up however much they allow you to take at a time, and use ad lib. And that's where we are at the moment. One concern, even though there's no strong evidence linking cannabis use to lung health, is the combustion of a plant material. Obviously, we would want to do no harm, and there is a concern in recommending that people inhale smoke as a medical treatment. So who knows what we'll do there. Now, again, oral administration of cannabinoids offers one possibility for standardization. It doesn't come with the risk of inhaling smoke, but the pharmacokinetics and dynamics are different when ingesting as opposed to smoking, and from what we can gather, most people who use prefer to smoke because they can titrate their dose. It's much harder to do when you administer orally. So I think there are a lot of challenges for the development of cannabis as a medicine. And right now we see that there are mostly patient advocacy groups that are pushing for medical cannabis, but this is all happening outside of sort of the FDA approval process. Now, if you've ever been, how many people have been to a state where cannabis is legal either for medical or recreational purposes? Only a few. So I moved here from San Francisco. I'm not a Californian, I'm from Virginia, I'm from the DC area. But I was really amused when I first moved there. In the back of the weekly papers, you see ads for physicians who will give you an assessment for a medical marijuana card. And it's something of a joke because people know that you can visit one of these professionals and say, I don't have an appetite, I have trouble sleeping, I'm anxious, and for whatever reason you give them, they'll provide you with a medical marijuana card, provided you pay them $70, $90, whatever it might be. Then you can obtain as much cannabis as you'd like. So the process at the moment is not one that follows the sort of traditional medical model, and there are probably some unscrupulous people who are making a lot of money in the process, and we'd like to see that change. Again, I don't have a good answer as to how we might do that, but I think that's something to consider as this unfolds. So I want to leave some time for questions, but in summary, it does look like cannabis exhibits potential in a variety of areas, but especially for chronic pain as an opioid alternative. But we need to be careful with regard to safety and risk assessments, right? We can't assume that there are no risks associated with cannabis use, because there are. But the preliminary evidence suggests that it's useful for pain. It can be efficacious and it's well tolerated. But when you come across the literature, especially in popular media, note that you often find two camps, and one is cannabis or marijuana is bad, period. The other is it's a cure-all and it has no risks whatsoever. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, perhaps a little more so toward it being a fairly benign drug and potentially helpful in some areas. But be a critical thinker when you evaluate the evidence, especially as it's reported in the popular media. So, we have some time. We have about 15 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? Yes? In terms of how effective it is for pain? Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question?
Where does marijuana fall in the scale compared with opioids or other pain relievers?
With regard to its effectiveness? I don't know that it's been compared directly to opioids. If off the top of my head, I would gather that it is probably not as effective in managing acute pain. I think opioids are very helpful medications for managing acute pain, especially in hospital settings. There's really no evidence that opioids are effective for chronic pain. I should say for chronic pain that's not cancer related. So that's kind of an interesting development in the future. It might be that for chronic pain that's not cancer related, opioids are not indicated because there's really no evidence that they're effective. But there is evidence, there's preliminary evidence that cannabis is. So my guess would be, with regard to acute pain, opioids are probably more effective, but for chronic pain, cannabis may be.
What can we do to speed this along?
Oh. So the question is, what can we do to speed along the process of either decriminalization or legalization? There are a lot of different things that we could do, right? And when in the political sphere, when there is a mention of liberalizing our drug laws, you often see this sort of hyperbole. Oh my goodness, we shouldn't have marijuana available on every street corner for everyone. No one's making that argument. Right? And if you go to a place like Colorado, you'll find it's regulated. You have to be at least 21. There are dispensaries that are very secure. And in fact, you see in these states a reduction in use among children and adolescents, right? Because when a drug is available legally, it reduces the black market activity. It makes it difficult for children and adolescents to obtain the drug if there's less so-called black market activity and they can't obtain it legally. So I think there are actually some benefits in liberalizing our drug laws, but there are many different things that we could do, starting with maybe a decriminalization to regulation of medical marijuana. One concern I do have is if we make this a for-profit industry, because as is the case with alcohol and tobacco, the lion's share of the profits are derived from very heavy users, that the industry would have a motive to create heavy users. And I'm worried about that. I don't really want a for-profit industry that's suddenly motivated to get people to use a lot. So I think we have to be very careful about how we are going to liberalize our laws, and there are many different ways of doing it. There's a spectrum. We should be very cautious, and it probably makes sense in a place like Alabama to have like a test market. So you could start in Mobile or Montgomery or Birmingham and see how a certain policy might affect certain public health outcomes, and if it seems successful, move from there. But one problem is once you've deregulated this drug, there's really no going back. So it's like opening Pandora's box. You can't put the lid back on the box. So alcohol is a serious, serious public health problem, but it's been around since before recorded history. And in the short amount of time that we tried to, prohibit its sales or its marketing, its distribution in the U.S., people just weren't having it. People have been drinking for a long time, and there's no going back now. And I think that's one reason why we should be very careful about how we do it. But how do we do it? I think obviously it comes down to who you vote for. But I just think it makes sense, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, that you try to think about this in an objective way with attention to the facts. And I think some of the political rhetoric is just misleading. But I think if you live in Birmingham, I think Randall Woodfin has been a proponent of liberalizing marijuana laws. And I think there are some on his team who are at least talking about decriminalization. So if somebody, let's say, actually has a problem, an addiction, that we wouldn't punish them for that, but refer them to treatment, which I think makes a lot of sense for all drugs. That we wouldn't take someone who's struggling with a medical issue and treat them like a criminal, but refer them to treatment. I teach at UAB, so I'm really used to standing up here in complete silence. It doesn't feel awkward to me. I know somebody has a question. I know someone has a good question. Come on, hit me with your best one.
legalization as a medicine is going to be with standardization of what a dose is and how to prescribe it. And the current prescribing practices are basically, they just write and you just take it ad lib as you,
Right.
quote you. What happens whenever there's legal ramifications associated with that prescription of it's now on you legally for the benefit of this patient, and there can be tort or malpractice suits against you
Yeah.
for prescribing a medication that has no standardization.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. The question is, so in the future, given that it's very difficult to standardize this drug, or even if we do, how does that work for a prescriber? And what about the legal ramifications of that system? And I really wish I had an answer for you. I think that's sort of the Wild West of cannabis. We don't really know how to standardize it. We can standardize THC, but then we recognize that cannabis is more than just THC. And I don't know. It's kind of outside of my area of expertise, and I can only say I think it's complicated, and someone needs to figure it out. Yes.
Is there any scientific fact that it does not produce lung disease?
Well, I can't imagine that inhaling smoke is ever going to be good. So the question is it a scientific fact that it does not produce lung disease? Let me go back a couple. So there is mixed and weak results that link marijuana use to respiratory cancer, right? So some studies indicate there's no link. Some do, but when they do, it's a very weak association. So we don't really know what's going on. I think it's common sense, and my 4-year-old son could tell you that inhaling smoke is not good for your lungs. But lungs are also pretty darn resilient, and if you know anything about Birmingham's air quality, you know it's very poor, but our lungs can take a pretty high degree of punishment. So the question is, at what point would cannabis use become problematic, especially with regard to your lungs? The majority of users would report using some weekends, and that's probably not enough to bring about any serious lung disease. But for someone who's smoking, let's say, all day, every day, I would imagine that would be very bad for their lungs.
In a young, healthy person, you could probably remove 40% of the lung without symptoms, really. And
Yeah.
therefore, you don't know until you're very late in the process that you have damage.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And if you consider even cigarette smokers could smoke a pack per day, that's 20 cigarettes every day for years and years and years before they develop a problem. And in some cases, they don't. So, and that's why I'm saying lungs are pretty darn resilient. I just think it's common sense that inhaling smoke is not a good idea. And that's why I think that the future is probably not at least combusted flower. Maybe it's vaporizing the flower or vaporizing the hashish or the distillates. That's bound to be less harmful. But I think ideally we could have a oral administration. But then the question is, how do you capture the complexity of that plant into one kind of standardized oral dose? I don't know. Okay, I gather there are no more questions. You still have 10 minutes. Don't be afraid. All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.